On September 24th, 2025, 29-year-old Joshua John killed one and wounded two detainees at an ICE facility in Dallas, Texas. According to the FBI, inscriptions of anti-ICE were found on an unused bullet near the scene, and thus the Trump-controlled administration were quick to fire the left-wing extremist violence rhetorical cannons. Augustus Gloop, all grown up, J.D. Vance, jumped on the opportunity to blame the shooter as a politically motivated, violent left-wing extremist. Person we should all be terrified of how she'll look in 30 years, Kristi Noem, mentioned how this was a wake-up call for the far left. Hall of Fame Trump cum-guzzling champion Ted Cruz let out an impassioned statement calling for politically motivated violence to stop. And even Don himself squirted out an epic boomer post with 0 paragraph indentations yelling at deranged radical leftists. There were also reports of how he was allegedly targeting ICE personnel, even though only detainees were shot, including one killed. But come on, those damn immigrants are barely people. The real tragedy was how close the bullets got to our good old law protectors. And didn't you see those scary writings on the bullet? This was after knowing nothing about the shooter, only the supposed writing on a bullet. This is all it takes to justify a righteous crusade against your political adversaries. Case closed, release the hounds. Just to get it out of the way, we're supposed to believe this guy, a man whose presence reeks such dubious untrustworthiness. I would have serious suspicion if he told me the earth was round, concerning the bullet engravings. He also just willy-nilly posted this mass shooting evidence on, Twitter, like all serious FBI officials do. So, who was this radical leftist shooter? Well, turns out he wasn't really into politics too much. According to his friends, he was, get this, an edgelord. He was never really into politics, especially not politicians, said another friend, who had known John since he was age 8. He was into politics only in the 4chan sense. Contrarian, provocative, boundary-pushing for laughs, not conviction. Doesn't sound like any of you, I know. I mostly stopped talking to him when he took his 4chan/irony stuff into daily interactions, one friend told me. He was becoming unbearable. Once he dropped out of college, he had no obligation to be social, and none of us reached out due to his edgelord behavior. Whatever, right? What am I doing bringing this shit up when he did the political violence and wrote the political thingy on the bullet? Political radical terrorist, case closed. Here's another mass shooter, Patrick Wood Crusius, or commonly known as the El Paso Walmart shooter, who killed 23 and injured 22 in an act of anti-Hispanic immigrant hate and fear of a Hispanic invasion. Huge surprise, he was an 8chan guy, double the 4 of 4, posting his manifesto on the Poll forum, as well as partaking in the depressingly familiar neo-Nazi circle jerk that goes on there, white nationalism, fears of the Great Replacement and a migrant invasion, vilifying pussy bitch-ass leftoids and their unbearable egalitarianism, all just a trick by the Jewish Democrats to snuff out the white race, etc. The founder of 8chan has said regarding the platform, the other anonymous users are guiding what's socially acceptable, and the more and more you post on there, you're being affected by what's acceptable, and that changes you. Maybe you start posting Nazi memes as a joke, but you start to absorb those beliefs as your own, eventually. It being a circle jerk is no exaggeration. Lonely losers, outcasts, misfits, and down on their luck Ubermenschen congregate to this and similar anonymous forums to laugh, cry, languish, and fester together in a cesspool of self-fulfilling cynicism. The point of this pseudo-community isn't to come together towards something better or some hoity-toity bullshit. It's to justify misery and perpetuate your preconceived hatred. And most importantly, it supports the grand narrative, something that must be preserved and passed on, but we'll get to that later. And the point of this video isn't to blame anonymous forums for all the world's problems. Was the El Paso Walmart shooter's actions not a political act? He explicitly stated his very political intent, motive, and justification, far more politically radical than anything proposed by the FBI about the ICE shooter. Was this just a one-off case of some crazy guy going a little crazy? Where were the calls to crack down on far-right extremist violence in 2019? Where were the impassioned calls for fairness, humanity, and justice by the proclaimed moral majority or conservative thought leaders at the time? What makes an act of violence political to begin with? What factors in our society, media landscape, and material reality impact ideology enough to warrant violence? How does political policy affect some seemingly random people into acts of violence with a myriad of political implications? It's worthwhile to take a step back. You're probably familiar with the Columbine school shooting. If you're anything like me, back in the day, my friends and I would chuckle at a meme involving the two who killed 14 and injured 23 in 1999. Maybe something making light of the shooter's appearance, or who we thought the shooter would be if it happened at our school. Maybe we'd feel some kind of morbid awe at camera footage of the massacre, in like a dude, what the fuck kind of way. Pretty run-of-the-mill edgy boy shit. At the time, the motive for such a shooting was perplexing, shocking, and mysterious. Mental illness was at the forefront of discussion. The shooters had a history of depression, despair at society and their school life, a self-fulfilling cynicism, but no clear or coherent reasonings other than just cuz, essentially. This led to a mudslide of conspiracy theories and misinformation. Marilyn Manson, video games, and goth culture were blamed. Westboro Baptist Church founder Fred Phelps blamed the shooting on the gay, claiming that two filthy F-slurs slaughtered 13 people at Columbine High. Televangelist and Goblin King lookalike Jerry Falwell said basically the same thing. Back in this time period, there was at least a semi-serious debate around gun control, before gun violence just miraculously joined death and taxes as certainties of life. The Columbine shooting was a massive shockwave to this whole arena, and in extremely tasteful fashion. Right-wingers, religiously attached to the Second Amendment, of which is utilized as a canary in the coal mine for radical Marxist tyranny, claimed the shooting was staged and the shooters were government agents, or that it was a Jewish conspiracy to take your guns away.
Just to be completely honest about it, this is a lot of news. Clinton wanting to ban guns, come out tomorrow with that, or something along those lines. You got the Washington Times, they want to charge the parents of the Columbine MK Ultra provocateur killers. Well, like I said, Clinton wants to ban guns. It'll get a lot worse than this before it ends. Hell, we'll be a lot safer without guns, won't we?
None of this was brand new sentiment or rhetoric. The shooting was just a convenient occurrence to reify preconceived notions and interests. The outrage industry got a fresh shipment of juicy tragedy to turn into golden slop, and nobody wanted to be connected to the reasons as to how or why a couple boys could do such a thing. The Columbine shooters barely had anything anyone could call a motive, had murky professed ideological underpinnings, and for all that it mattered, no purported reason to live. This was no mystical origin story of a monster or a one-off psychotic freak accident, but a common sentiment being shared by countless young people, feeling ever alienated, hopeless, and cynical towards a world seemingly passing them by. Education is impersonal, career prospects are slim, mainstream media and pop culture is vapid and uninteresting. Fire and brimstone constantly swirling around you. Shit is either expensive or unattainable. You've got at least a dozen guys screaming at you to be pissed off at someone or some group of people. Pain, violence, and death surrounds you everywhere you look. It's unsurprising to see young people in these circumstances feel so alienated, hopeless, cynical, and nihilistic. An unbearable reality can warrant a desire to escape. It's understandable to see young people gravitate towards nerd culture like video games or alternative music when mainstream reality is so upsetting. But can you ever truly escape from the groundwork laid out underneath you? And how long can you simply escape when the whole world feels like it's against you? Do you even really want to simply escape? Or do you crave long overdue power, attention, and something to live or die for? A violent and vengeful society can imprint this violent DNA, even on those wishing to escape it. Not quite gallows humor, but rather gallows existence. My friends and I sought an escape from the humdrum of an undesirable reality by laughing at absurd and ridiculous things, such as a school shooting. Modern social media has bred morbid fandoms for edgy anti-heroes of escape like the Columbine shooters. I relate to their feelings of hopelessness, being angry and not being able to change it, and wanting to be accepted and appreciated. A number of media portrayals and even a video game were made in the Columbine shooting. But others took away different conclusions. Others were inspired to flee their kindred isolation after putting up with far too much abuse and torment and claim the power, attention, and glory they rightfully deserved. Doesn't matter if this is all bullshit. If you actually do have a family and a social circle and some prospects, etc., an acknowledgement of these privileges negates the righteous glory and satisfying story so desperately sought after. The escape to glory is done with a blindfold and a firearm. The Columbine shooters are well known for their journals and home videos. The glorification of such material is responsible for a number of copycats and kindred spirits seeking an escape to glory, deserved attention, and a satisfying narrative. On the Wikipedia page for the Columbine Effect, at least 74 copycat incidents are listed. Just 8 days after the Columbine shooting, in Alberta, Canada, at the W.R. Myers High School, a 14-year-old shooter killed one and injured one. He reportedly snapped after watching news coverage about the Columbine High School massacre. In November 1999, in Germany, a shooter who killed 5 and injured 7 reportedly told his friends of the Columbine attack was something we should do. In Argentina in 2004, after watching The Elephant, a movie based on the Columbine massacre, a shooter killed 3 and injured 5 after being inspired and wanting to become like Eric and Dylann. A shooter in Ulster, New York in 2005 reportedly had Columbine memorabilia. A 2006 Idaho shooting was inspired by Eric and Dylann. A 2007 Boulder, Colorado shooter shouted prior to the attack, "We are Columbine." A 2008 attack at a school in South Africa involving a katana was influenced by the Columbine massacre. In 2010 in England, a 16-year-old boy attempted to kill his sister and listed as his occupation shooting up schools like Columbine. A 2011 Netherlands shooter who killed 7 and injured 17 researched the Columbine massacre prior to the shooting. A 2012 Texas shooter who killed 3 was reportedly fascinated by the Columbine school massacre. The 2012 Aurora, Colorado shooter, commonly known as the Dark Knight shooter or the Joker theater shooter, killed 12 and injured 58 at a movie theater. He did in-depth research about the Columbine massacre to see what the police response time would be and how much ammo he would need. I think we get the point here. One particular event stood out to me though. A month to the day after the Columbine shooting, a 15-year-old student in Georgia shot 6 students, but no one died. He allegedly referenced the Columbine shooters in a note, but according to a student witness at the school, he wasn't aiming. He was holding it down low, he wasn't chasing people. In other words, Solomon went about his work almost reluctantly, shooting literally from the hip with a pump-action sport gun. The shooter apparently went through a breakup right before the shooting. The kid had a girlfriend at least, had friends, was a former Boy Scout. He was bullied for being quiet, he had a fascination with guns, much like any other boy in rural Georgia. He was an edgy boy, reportedly bragging about bringing guns to school before and threatened to kill himself. He was going through shit a lot of other young boys go through, and like a lot of other young boys, sought an escape to a world with a story worth living and dying for. But also, like so many other young boys, he reached for the only things he thought were available: a blindfold and a firearm. It was almost as if this choice was compulsive. There's no way you could ask for help like a bitch or go running to mommy. That's all gay shit. A young man needs to assert his will, forge your own path, take what's yours. Might is the only way, there's no other choice. There's no way anyone could understand. My life is just too twisted, and this story is my own. But he was clearly struggling beneath the blindfold. He had the option of using multiple high-powered firearms that belonged to his father, but only used the .22, and he aimed so low to the point of apparent reluctance. The weight of some societal or ideological pressure was compelling this boy to do something he clearly had a difficult time doing, even with the helpful blindfold. What is this societal or ideological force, making a brazen act of extreme violence the go-to response for typical young man problems? The Columbine shooters had the same force attached to them. In Eric Harris's journal, he made frequent references to natural selection, writing that he would like to put everyone in a super doom game and see to it that the weak die and the strong live. On the day of the shooting, Harris wore a shirt with the words "natural selection" on it. Dylan Klebold wrote often about his godlike status and feelings of superiority over other human beings, in tandem with frequent writings on self-loathing and depression. The only solution to this depression and denial of his rightful supremacy by society was putting his supposed strength into action. His shirt on the day of the shooting read, "Wrath." Their journals also referenced the Oklahoma City bombing and wanted to outdo its death count. The Oklahoma City bombing was perpetrated by Timothy McVeigh on April 19, 1995, and killed 168 people, including 19 children, and injured 684. Even today, it's still the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. Timothy McVeigh was a white supremacist, obsessed with the Second Amendment and gun rights, despised taxes, the Democrats, and the government. Well, except the part of the government that paid him to blow up brown people in Iraq. Does this sound familiar at all? Timothy McVeigh considered his actions justified due to the arrogance and oppressive power of Clinton, the Democrats, and what he considered the left, describing the 19 children he killed as collateral damage. Reactionary extreme violence was the only solution to these problems. No other thought or concern need to be inserted into this decision. The blindfold is on and glory awaits. Whatever excuses of social alienation or isolation, much like the Columbine shooters, ring hollow when you take into account that these people had families and friends, and at least somewhat capable prospects, but that doesn't matter when the blindfold of righteousness is donned, and the protagonist plays his part in the grand narrative. Righteous violence is the only solution. It will make a stronger society by culling the weak and asserting our godlike power by force. Might makes right. To these people in Oklahoma who have lost a loved one, I'm sorry, but it happens every day. You're not the first mother to lose a kid, or the first grandparent to lose a grandson or a granddaughter. It happens every day, somewhere in the world. I'm not gonna go into that courtroom, curl into a fetal ball, and cry just because the victims want me to do that. The ideological force of might makes right is what tempts these murderers, like a siren song, to don the blindfold and assert their will. First coming into history by the ancient Greeks, specifically by
Thucydides
in the history of the Peloponnesian War written around 410 BC, stating, "Right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must." In Plato's Republic, Thrasymachus argues to Socrates that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger. "Woe to the conquered," wrote Livy. These writings may be the first in written history, but harken back to the most primordial days of human existence. The melding of such ancient and wise sentiments proved quite fascinating and useful for 18th and 19th century thinkers and leaders, primarily in the imperialist and colonialist West. Nietzsche's will to power, social Darwinism, the law of the jungle, Machiavellianism, natural selection, all melded together into one common phrase and sentiment, coined by polarizing New Zealand writer Arthur Desmond. He is a whole other story that I'm not going to get into right now. Might is right. Desmond's book, under the pseudonym Ragnar Redbeard, had the subheading and alternate title, Survival of the Fittest, and has a long legacy of influencing countless people, in particular proto-fascists of the early 20th century, all the way up to today's neo-Nazis and far-right thought leaders. The book glorifies the primeval concept of justice being nothing other than the interest of the stronger. He proclaims the Anglo-Saxon race to be superior, and that women exist to be conquered by a dominant man, amongst other sentiments that really don't differ too much from modern-day red pillars and whatnot. Might making right is not limited to justifying solitary acts of wanton violence. It justifies economic policy like free market capitalism, where competition snuffs out the weak and rewards the stronger.
There's a great friend of mine who did Survivor. I used to tell him, I said, Mark, the toughest jungle, it's not where you are with all these Survivor jungles. The toughest jungle is the jungle of Manhattan, the jungle of New York. And he said to me the other day, Donald, you're right. That's really the toughest place. It's the most beautiful place. It's the greatest place. It's the worst place. It's the most vicious place. It's the nicest place. It's just an amazing place. And it is a jungle at the same time. And it's eating these geniuses up alive. They're brilliant people. And they have IQs of 190, 195. We have a Harvard MBA who's a doctor. And we have really smart people. And they are being eaten alive by the jungle of New York and by Trump.
It justified colonialism and slavery, for the superior white European race must exert its supremacy over the inferior others. It justifies foreign intervention in wars, being necessary to cultivate a strong nation, at risk of being overrun by the inferior hordes, of which their precious natural resources are being wasted on. It justifies social and domestic policy, willingly condemning the most unfortunate among us to live on the street or to starve, or to suffer a cornucopia of mental illness, seemingly of mystical origin and limited recourse. The acceptable recourse, of course, being a blindfold and a firearm. These myriad utilities, justifications, and mystifications, along with the convenient dexterity afforded by the blindfold and godlike power of the weapon, help give this ideology an almost infectious character, an obsession with legacy and reliance on grand narrative for generations of right-wingers or those under the influence of right-wing policy. What other purpose is there in life besides domination by the strong and submission of the weak? Acts of dominance also serve as acts of inspiration. Like shown previously, the Columbine shooters have an extensive, influential legacy. Timothy McVeigh on them, and the Branch Davidians of Waco, Texas on him, and so on. Some mystical connection to a lauded, superior, dominant man, going back to the time of the ancient Greeks, King David of the Israelites, or even back to primitive early hominin. The legacy of the strong remains in our blood and must continue, lest the human race wither and die at the behest of the weak. It's a grand narrative capable of reaching any point in time and involving anything you need to make your desire for power and meaning justified, including death and oppression, because, well, might does make right. Speaking of being influenced by the Columbine shooters, the Sandy Hook massacre, where 20 first-grade children and 6 teachers were gunned down, was done by 20-year-old Adam Lanza, someone who had an immense amount of respect for and fascination with Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. He spent a considerable amount of time on a forum called Super Columbine Massacre RPG, named after the aforementioned video game, where he defended the actions of the shooters and, according to an online girlfriend of sorts, spent almost all of his time researching and discussing mass murders. He allegedly created a meticulous spreadsheet of previous mass murders and researched past shooters thoroughly. He had a history of severe depression, anorexia, and possible schizophrenia, as well as speech impediments that greatly alienated him from what he considered civilization and culture. Lanza was obsessed with the coercive powers of civilization and how cultural forces like education or therapy raped the minds of the innocent. He frequently referred to his desire of living in the wild with apes, a return to monkey of sorts, a sentiment not unfamiliar to the ideology of which we speak. Eric Harris detested civilization and culture as well, and used the godlike powers of might makes right to overcome it. Adam Lanza considered himself a victim of might makes right, dominating and ruining his prospects at happiness and fulfillment, which in some ways is true. His severe mental illness, like many other mass shooters in recent memory, was seemingly untreatable and doomed him in a world where the strong survive and the weak die. His only option was to assert what little power he could. The firearm made him godlike. The culling of first-grade children was justified due to his struggle for power in a twisted world order. He had to do what he had to do. What was the right's reaction to this massacre? Well, the same old hysteria about violent video games, of course, but the National Rifle Association's Wayne LaPierre shared that gun-free zones attract killers, and that every school should have armed security. The more guns, the safer. A right-wing movement known as the Truthers believed the shooting was, brace for it, a government plot to push stricter gun laws, and that Democrats are hiding the truth about the shooter and the shooting. WorldNet Daily columnist Eric Rush said that Sandy Hook shooter Adam Lanza positively reeked of what intelligence operatives I know would call the telltale signs of recruitment and conditioning. And he wondered if Lanza was the target of a government scheme to recruit vulnerable individuals for psyops to advance their diabolical agenda. Radio host Rick Wiles stated that Sandy Hook was timed to coincide with the political agenda of the Socialist Democrats, such as Barry Soetoro Obama, Chucky Schumer, and Dianne Feinstein, to pass stringent federal gun control laws. The shooting event was timed to coincide with the gun control initiative. Mike Huckabee blamed the Sandy Hook massacre on those who have tried to systematically remove God from our schools, turning schools into a place of carnage. He claimed that school shootings would be a thing of the past if only schools started organizing chapel services for students, and the government stopped ordering employers to provide tax-funded abortion pills. Ted Cruz proudly boasted of his role in successfully blocking the bipartisan Senate measure to expand background checks on gun purchases, bragging that, unlike Republican squishes, he stood firm in opposing universal background checks like a boss. The Sandy Hook affected families who supported the efforts, he said, were being used as political props. Ted Nugent blamed the shooting on America's politically correct culture and anything-goes value system which vilifies, condemns, and mocks traditional societal values and customs at every opportunity. You're damn right those gays had something to do with it too. Christian radio fuck James Dobson said in a tirade about the massacre, "I mean, millions of people have decided that God doesn't exist, or he's irrelevant to me, and we have killed 54 million babies, and the institution of marriage is right on the verge of a complete redefinition. Believe me, that is gonna have consequences too." Wait a minute, what the fuck, is this 1999? No, it's 2012. A mass shooting of primarily first-grade children is nothing more than a convenient launching pad for the right to yell at liberal gayness, but more importantly, advance the grand narrative. For Columbine and for Sandy Hook, the ideology of might makes right was hidden just enough to avoid blatant connection to right-wing ideology and policy, and the standard mainstream defective strategies continued to be utilized. These strategies obviously don't mean shit for opponents of the right. Right-wing policy was at the very least blatantly responsible for a guy having such easy access to firearms, but that can easily advance the narrative when twisted in certain ways, like it being a tyrannical government plot or gay, etc.
It took me about a year with Sandy Hook to come to grips with the fact that the whole thing was fake. I mean, even I couldn't believe it. I knew they jumped on it, used the crisis, hyped it up, but then I did deep research, and my gosh, it just pretty much didn't happen. Unbelievable.
What happens when this ideology isn't hidden? What happens when someone who shares the same values, follows the same groups, thinkers, forums, and spouts the same rhetoric, carries this ideology to its inevitable conclusion? Well, we can look at Timothy McVeigh, kind of a classic Tea Party, anti-government, Rush Limbaugh-loving Second Amendment defender, as well as a staunch white nationalist and proponent of might makes right. This stance is not anything crazy when compared to the typical right wing. In fact, compared to some others, it might even appear a bit tame. Nothing he espoused before or after the bombing could be seriously disagreed with by, for instance, Alex Jones, Richard Spencer, or Nick Fuentes, all the way down to the righteous imposition of violence, of course with the pretext of being defensive or in service to the nation, etc. The only thing easily disagreed with or condemned was the following through with this ideology, actually putting theory into practice. McVeigh did everything by the book, literally. One of his strongest influences, as well as for lots of other right-wingers, is the Turner Diaries, a 1978 book referred to as the Bible for the racist right. Because, I mean, the real Bible is way too long, am I right, fellas? The plot consists of similar far-right rhetoric of foreign invasion and contamination, an evil Marxist hive mind ruining society, and lots of black men raping white women, a lot of that. The protagonist eventually destroys an FBI building in DC with a bomb, and the country falls into a nuclear civil war where the strong survive and the weak are cold. Really a pleasant story. Timmy thought so too, hence his on-the-nose real-life interpretation. The Turner Diaries also popularized the concept of terrorism by leaderless resistance to trigger a race war. The leaderless resistance would help protect the terrorists from feds, so small and trusted cliques or lone actors were necessary. McVeigh's enacting of this concept would prove prophetic in its significance. What did right-wingers think of this? I mean, come on, he's a good old boy doing a good old deed, taking it to the Democrat-led federal government and defending your rights. Give the guy some kudos.
For a new listener and you don't know what a self-inflicted wound is, what a false flag is, Hitler blew up, firebombed his own Reichstag right after being elected, February 27th, 1933. So that's what a false flag is, and we've never had one so open to shut as Oklahoma City.
That's weird. It kind of sounds like Alex wasn't so keen to be attached to this righteous act. In fact, in right-wing circles, the Oklahoma City bombing is one of the principal examples of false flag operations committed by the federal government to make the right look bad. Well, that's not such a tall order, you kind of got that covered. Oh, it's because they need an excuse to take your guns and freedoms. I see. Well, if that's the case, you need to defend yourself. Your freedoms and precious guns are at stake. Hit the FBI before they hit you! Wait, you see what happened there. The very rhetoric and ideology propagated by right-wing media figures, think tanks, and thought leaders leads to an act, if not as massive in scale but similar in spirit to something like Timothy McVeigh did. Someone has to stand up to defend us. Our very lives and freedom are at stake. But this inevitable action cannot be outwardly praised or recognized as based or whatever, due to some taboo of respectability and nonviolence that permeates our liberal society. This is what I referred to in my previous video as Round 1 and Round 2 of a twisted game. Round 1 draws in combatants to partake in a civilized debate between left and right, but only serves as a means to get to Round 2, a no-holds-barred combat round, where words are put into action. The right-wing rhetorician in Round 1 tricks the opponent into agreeing to a made-up set of rules, which include respectability and civil nonviolence, but proceeds to espouse rhetoric directly disrespectful and violent to oftentimes the opponent themselves. The opponent either can remain within the confines of Round 1's rules and fight a losing battle forever, or move on to Round 2. The right-wing rhetorician knows Round 1 was just a trap to get to this point, and they can either proceed to fight personally, or allow a champion to do the fighting for them. The right owns this game because they know they have immunity from repercussions if they choose a champion wisely, and pretend to follow the rules ostensibly. Sometimes they don't need to choose at all. There are a multitude of fighters willing to put into action the key to Round 2. Might makes right. These fighters are molded by the conditions fostered by right-wing ideology and policy. Austerity, militaristic policing, ruthlessness, self-interest, etc. It just sucks that you have to adhere to such annoying rules in Round 1. More and more of the far right wants to discard these silly rules altogether, but a significant portion greatly value this whole game, especially when the system of power defends the same values and narrative you have. Round 1 may involve an argument of gun violence. The right-winger considers any infringement on the prospect of owning any number of any firearms an infringement of his God-given freedom, of which is the gravest offense known to man. Respectfully. A leftist opponent ensnared in this game may disagree with this for obvious reasons, and neither have any inclinations on backing down, for it's a matter of life and death. This intense gravity necessitates the next round, where the interlocutors must come to inevitable conclusions of their deeply held convictions that cannot be flimsily shied away from. A skilled right-wing rhetorician and player of the game knows all they have to do is sit back and wait with a smug smile. If the leftist opponent strikes then and there, they clearly broke the rules, were hysterically violent, and thus deserve the full weight of the system's swift punishment. In fact, this act is an indictment on the entirety of these sick, radical Marxist thugs. If the leftist opponent does not break the rules, it's only a matter of time before the right-winger's rhetoric is put into action and a champion is found. A gunman protecting his race or his right to bear arms, a patriot hitting the Marxist federal government before they hit first, or a kid donning the blindfold. This last one is tragic, sure, but quite convenient considering the ease of disguising their role in its possibility and continuing the grand narrative. Ease of access to, normalization and proliferation of, and lack of legislation of firearms is a right-wing policy. But some crazy guy just being crazy isn't an outcome of right-wing policy. Come on, they just so happen to get their hands on enough guns and ammo to kill a couple dozen children. It's a fact of life. But especially when it comes to gun violence, an issue so proudly attached to the right, the link can never be truly disguised. Any of these acts of violence can be easily denounced or condemned to remain respectable and allow right-wing rhetoric, policy, and the grand narrative to continue unabated. But deep down, they know the inextricable link this rhetoric and policy has on these acts of violence. Mass shootings cause a sinking feeling in the stomach, a hanging dread and guilt, a proliferation of firearms, and constant propaganda about enemies from within and evil deep state cabals and white genocide and threats to your very existence, etc., leads to people taking that shit seriously because, you're saying you're serious. And because the rhetoricians are indeed serious, they must desperately muddy the waters, distract, scapegoat, smear, conspire, lie, or just straight up ignore this link. The sinking pit in the stomach or sweating bullets easily turns into vindictive anger aimed at the opponent, desperately trying to alleviate the guilt. This comes in the form of immediately branding shooters radical leftists, or, especially today, trans or trans ideology adherents. If it all looks too good to be true, too good for the radical left, I mean, then it must be a psyop or a false flag or paid federal operatives. These excuses are eventually just coping strategies for you and the homeboys. But what is the difference between cope and narrative? And of course, for respectability's sake, you'll suck it up and say the words denounce and condemn and then attempt to distance yourself when the normies walk in.
And with the homosexuals and the transsexuals, please don't beat us up. We're fine. We just want to get married. It's all men and shmen and shmen and schwimmen and whatever, he, she's. We're all created equal. Please just be nice to us. And what is it now? The women, militant as ever, marching down the street naked. We're going to kill your babies. And it's the future is female men. And you better stay home. And we're all hopped up on birth control. I'm the devil. And the blacks now. Shut up, honky. We want reparations, yo. Before it was, please, we just want to sit at the lunch table. Now, shut up, honky. We want reparations. This is our town, bitch. And then what is it now? The homosexuals and the transsexuals. It's not just leave us alone. Now it's baked to effing cake. And we're basically going to go and dox you. And we're going to kill you. Hail Satan. That's what these people are saying. I love everybody. I'm down. I'm down with everything that's changed. I think this country's great, That was all satire. Everybody's equally competent. You know what? The white man had their chance. Things like order, things like the traditional family, morality, that's old school. That's anachronistic. It's 2019, okay? But being Christian just isn't moral. You know what is moral? Aborting children. That's what's really moral. Okay, I don't know if I can save myself anymore. It's impossible. We're coming up to a point where you can't be an authentic conservative. You know what? If being a campus conservative is a thought crime, lock me away. If being a Latino campus conservative is a crime, then lock me away.
Never believe that anti-Semites are completely unaware of the absurdity of their replies. They know that their remarks are frivolous, open to challenge, but they are amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly, since he believes in words. The anti-Semites have the right to play. They even like to play with discourse, for by giving ridiculous reasons, they discredit the seriousness of their interlocutors. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they seek not to persuade by a sound argument, but to intimidate and disconcert. If you press them too closely, they will abruptly fall silent, loftily indicating by some phrase that the time for argument is past. Let's keep all that in mind and go to 2011. Norwegian neo-Nazi Anders Breivik killed 8 with a van bomb and shot and killed 69 and aims to save European culture and to prevent cultural Marxism and political correctness from turning Europe into an Islamic hellhole. In his 1518-page manifesto, Cyberpunk 2083, a European Declaration of Independence, he talked about how he considered himself a modern Knights Templar, defending Europe from a Muslim invasion. It included standard xenophobic and Islamophobic sentiments and hatred of cultural Marxism that warranted a vigorous and violent defense. He quoted Napoleon saying, "He who saves his country violates no law." He quotes the Turner Diaries and various far-right authors and thinkers, particularly at the time so-called anti-jihadists, such as Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller. Both of these people, despite being vehemently anti-Islam and anti-immigration, distanced themselves from this practitioner of their own rhetoric. Robert Spencer, despite being cited by Breivik 64 times in his manifesto, and he said, "About Islam, I recommend essentially everything written by Robert Spencer," condemned Breivik and said he was unfairly blamed. Geller, after deleting a 2007 post on her blog, Atlas Shrugs, where a reader from Norway described their stockpile of weapons, ammo, and equipment, said that if anyone incited him to violence, it was Islamic supremacists. She then stated the youth camp where the shooting took place, where Breivik shot and killed 69, of whom over half were under 18, that it was all an anti-Semitic indoctrination center where children with a clearly pro-Islamic agenda play war games. Breivik was targeting the future leaders of the party responsible for flooding Norway with Muslims who refuse to assimilate, who commit major violence against Norwegian natives, including violent gang rapes with impunity, and who live on the dole, all without the consent of the Norwegian. He defecated in a sunroof! Oh, she's kind of giving it away a bit. Anders Breivik himself has said that he used anti-Islam rhetoric, such as from Spencer or Geller, to protect ethno-nationalists from media scrutiny and instead start a hunt against anti-nationalist counter-jihadist supporters in a strategy he calls double psychology. He was really a Nazi this whole time! He was just using bigoted, ethnocentric far-right rhetoric that he agreed with to cover for his other bigoted, ethnocentric far-right rhetoric. Genius move. Far-right groups love to obscure themselves behind a murky mire of ever-shifting and nebulous categorizations, meant to act as mutually exclusive groups, detached from that other group with the bad optics. They aren't white supremacists, they're race realists. They aren't ethnocentrists, they're identitarians. They aren't Nazis, they're National Socialists. They aren't Islamophobic xenophobes, they're anti-jihadists, and blah blah blah. Doesn't matter what little fan club you're officially part of, you agree with the rhetoric, and that's that, you slippery little fuck.
We are merely campus conservatives.
This isn't to say groups on the far right aren't fractured and all over the place. Discrepancies in ideology make different people have different reactions to undeniable acts of far-right violence. It may make it either easy to denounce as crazy or as some kind of fed or puppet, or some combination. Someone more mainstream, like a conservative politician or media pundit, might opt for the former to preserve respectability. An out-and-about Nazi like Varg Vikernes, someone who Anders Breivik personally emailed his manifesto to, might opt for the latter to preserve integrity. What matters is the grand narrative stays intact, and the copious amount of muddy water and blindfolds passed out makes sure it does. Breivik is the undeniable link between innocuous anti-Islamic conservative politicians, writers, and thinkers, and real white supremacist mass murderers. He lauded a number of far-right European politicians who ran on anti-Islam platforms. He frequented fascist online forums like Stormfront and VNN, and shared similar sentiments with other fascists, who also lauded far-right politicians and rhetoricians. These rhetoricians constantly proclaim an imminent collapse at the hands of cultural Marxists and Muslim invaders, and people like Anders Breivik take that shit seriously. There is no significant separation between the rhetorician and the perpetrator. The violence is expected. By their very own rhetoric, it's warranted and righteous. They are the slick soothsayers of round 1, and they are the champions of round 2. It's gotta be frustrating to be forced into a respectability charade and not praise these champions. Some right-wingers can't resist, especially those under the guise of anonymity on the internet, or comfortable chilling with the bros at the rally or whatever. Some right-wingers use it as an opportunity to signify their own purity. Varg and David Duke, for instance, rejected Breivik because of his support for Israel as an ethnocentrist state. They would rather save the praise for a real white supremacist. And they don't really care about the respectability charade. I mean, come on, can't get much worse than fucking Grand Wizard of the KKK. Let us not forget the impetus on legacy and influence. Breivik took inspiration from a number of far-right terrorist attacks in Norway. Arsons, bombings, shootings, carried out by Erik Blucher's Norwegian Front, by the Norwegian Germanic Army, and various neo-Nazis throughout the 90s and aughts. In his court hearings, he gave an arbitrary division of these attacks between racially motivated attacks on immigrants and attacks on leftists, of which Breivik's attack on a youth labor group fit into the latter. He said, "But it confirms that there has been a right-wing extremist tradition of violence that can be considered in opposition to the multiculturalist project. Even though these attacks have been poor, I at least see some of them as heroes. They have very much sacrificed their lives for the cause, even though they did not achieve much." Opposition to the multicultural project may come in ostensibly different forms and packages. Anti-jihadists, white nationalists, identitarians, race realists, grand wizards, or proud boys. They are united in its grander aims, and they know it. The denouncing, condemning, distancing, and disassociation is a means of muddying the waters, and allows a chipping away at the multicultural project without any repercussion, because, I mean, they did denounce the violence they called for. In a similar vein, what's interesting with Anders Breivik is that support for him amongst the far right came in waves. Initially, he received considerable support from Russian and Eastern European neo-Nazis, and mainly silence from the West. One such reporter was Nikolai Korolyov, a Russian terrorist sentenced to life in prison for having orchestrated the bombing of a marketplace in Moscow in 2008, killing 61 people. During the early days of Breivik's imprisonment, Norwegian correctional services did not stop letter exchanges between Breivik and his supporters. As a result, Korolev was able to reach Breivik via a network of Russian activists operating on his behalf. In his letter, Korolev paid respect to Breivik and promised that his clandestine prisoner network fully supported Breivik's creative abilities, offering him their trust. In the letter Breivik wrote in response, he accepted Korolev's proposal of cooperation between them. Later, Korolev commented extensively on Breivik's motivation and actions in the second volume of his so-called Skinhead Bible, hailing Breivik as someone who proved how much a single person can do in fighting the system. His cred in Western far-right circles grew as the internet grew, with places like 4chan and 8chan, of which Breivik is still a commonly used term. A number of neo-Nazi forums came and went over the course of the years, but the legacy of Anders Breivik continued to grow. His embodiment of the leaderless resistance and continuation of the grand narrative served as inspiration for others to do the same, but not only for explicit white supremacists and far-right terrorist wannabes. He inspired equally as many supposedly apolitical edgelords and lone actor terrorists to face their problems and, conscious of it or not, cope with right-wing policy with a blindfold on and a firearm in hand. Apolitical edgelords serve as convenient tools to chip away at the multicultural project with no repercussions, except maybe a refocusing of the spotlight on gun control. But that also gives us another chance to highlight the Jewish ploy to disarm you. False flag, Jewish ploy, defending gun rights, denounce and condemn, all effective measures to protect the narrative of persecution and to continue being a bigoted asshole. Fast forward a couple years to 2015. In Charleston, South Carolina, then 21-year-old Dylann Roof shot 10 and killed 9 churchgoers, all black, in an act of white supremacist violence. Dylann Roof had an extensive digital catalog of espoused neo-Nazi and white supremacist belief, including his website, The Last Rhodesian, in reference to the white settler state of Rhodesia in modern-day Zimbabwe, and of which has become a common symbol of reverence amongst neo-Nazis. He spoke frequently about the intellectual and ethical superiority of whites over blacks, referencing pseudo-scientific dreck like the IQ bell curve, and critiqued the melting pot fallacy. He was part of the infamous hate group Council of Conservative Citizens, and he was concerned about the corruptive power close proximity to the blacks warranted, and that a pure white nationalist goal can only be achieved by force. The virtue and rightness of his cause will be justified by might. What was the reaction of the right? This was only 3 years after Sandy Hook, mind you. If starting a race war is what this kid is about, he did it in the worst possible way, said Kirk Lyons, a prominent lawyer who has defended KKK members, supporters of the old Southern Confederacy, and a notorious Holocaust denier. He also stated the attack had a Manchurian candidateness. Ben Jones, of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and a one-time actor who appeared on the Dukes of Hazzard, said, "We must not allow the sickness of one demented individual to become that with which the media and our politically correct opponents define us. We are the same good-hearted people that we were last week and last year, and even in 2012. Neo-Nazi online forums like Stormfront and VNN flooded with reactions from users such as, "This all seems too scripted. Possibly Zionists are behind this? Who else would benefit from an all-out civil war?"
Oh, that's a great point. He wasn't just trying to kill black people. He wanted to stir folks up, or whoever advised him. I mean, does anybody believe this chili bowl haircut guy that looks like he's got a 70 IQ? I mean, he looks, I don't mean to be mean, he looks mentally disabled. He looks like Dumb and Dumber. Does anybody believe he would be, because you can see all the preparation building towards this. This is the big move, is a race war to bring in total chaos and then total federalization with this evil Justice Department. They've even gotten rid of the other attorney general who had baggage to put the new one in for the political persecutions of conservatives and Christians. They're dropping the hammer.
As an aside, all the guys on places like Stormfront, when they talk about shootings by far-right people, they always like broach the subject of civil war as if it's like, oh no, this will start the civil war. That's terrible. Hold on. What association with white supremacy and Rhodesia and shit do you have, Alex? Was this some crazy neo-Nazi guy that has nothing to do with your values, or was he a false flag perfectly designed to make you look bad and warrant your targeting? The Charleston shooting and its aftermath in many ways solidified mainstream conservatism with the far right. even if the distinction between the two was dubious before. Dylann Roof brought them together. Anti-government Second Amendment protecting campus conservatives and white supremacist neo-Nazis, subconsciously or consciously, understood the dynamic. They got the memo. The grand narrative underwent a singularity. It didn't happen right away, and it wasn't anything perfectly novel. The far right, being white supremacist neo-Nazis, didn't come to be in 2015. Someone like Timothy McVeigh in 1995, or just the KKK decades before that, shared essentially the same values and ideology, a united opposition to the multicultural project, and might making that opposition right. But the Charleston shooting was a key moment that sent the far right into a trajectory we still see today, a trajectory that was wholly familiar and almost ritualistic. After the shooting, there was an effort by some southern states to remove Confederate monuments and rename streets named after Confederate leaders. This prompted backlash from Southern conservatives, making the old argument of, "It's my heritage" and whatnot. And when in 2017, the Charlottesville City Council decided to remove Robert E. Lee's statue and rename it from Lee Park to Emancipation Park, the floodgates were unleashed. We saw a nighttime rally led by white supremacist Richard Spencer, and, well, let's just hear what went on that night. What do the Jews have to do with Confederate generals and heritage and shit? Oh, right, the Jews are controlling the policy that leads to waves of brown immigrant hordes to replace the white race. I almost forgot. This is, of course, a staple of far-right neo-Nazi ideology in the narrative, something shared by the Klan years ago, but we saw at Charlottesville the solidification of good old conservative GOP shit and outright Nazi shit, like Jewish cabal conspiracies. A solidification that quite literally united the right in a modern, internet-addled world. Speaking of the Klan, yeah, they were there too. A lot of them, coming from neighboring states like North Carolina. David Duke, the Klan imperial wizard that received a personal email from Anders Breivik, he was there too, along with the who's who of neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups, media figures, writers, leaders, militias, and just Pepe-type edgelord trolls too. Here's a snippet of some rhetoric being tossed around on August 11th and 12th.
You will not replace us. You and your cultural Marxist faggot bullshit. You will not replace us. Did Hitler do anything wrong? No! Fuck no. Yeah. Everybody repeat me. Pay close attention. Because this is the first precept of the true alt-right. Remember it. Gas the kites, raise war now! Gas the kites, raise war now! Who brought the ovens?
Gavin McInnes, proud Jew hater and white supremacist, was invited but refused to show up, stating that we need to distance ourselves from them being explicit neo-Nazis. Thinly veiled neo-Nazis like himself were good hangs, but not those explicit guys. After backlash to the original disavowal flared up from alt-right circles, the statement was withdrawn and replaced with another distancing the Proud Boys from the event, yet also encouraging those who feel compelled to attend. Gavin McInnes, similar in some ways to how real ones like Varg levied criticism and distanced himself from an Israel supporter like Anders Breivik, received criticism and backlash from real ones unimpressed with his apparent cowardice. He continues to be viewed as a little bitch amongst the truest of the true Nazis, unable to decide whether or not he wants to be a round one rhetorician or round two warrior champion guy. One of the original organizers of the Charlottesville rallies, and also fellow thinly veiled neo-Nazi Jason Kessler, attempted to distance himself from the Klan rallies that coincided with his own. He also stated, "I disavow any political violence and what happened yesterday was tragic." What happened that was tragic? Oh yeah, after getting kicked out by counter-protesters, James Alex Fields drove his car into a crowd, killing 1 and injuring 35. Video footage and eyewitness testimony show that Fields was not under attack before he rammed his car into a crowd. Evidence introduced at trial included a text message exchanged the day before the rally, in which Fields' mother wrote to him, "Be careful." And Fields responded with a picture of Adolf Hitler and the message, "We're not the ones who have to be careful." Real cool thing to show your mother. Prosecutors also played a jailhouse phone recording of Fields after the attack, in which Fields called the slain woman's mother a communist and anti-white liberal. Jason Kessler, after doing his obligatory denouncing and condemning of political violence, and most likely catching some flack by some real ones about it, tweeted a couple days later, Heather Heyer was a fat, disgusting communist. Communists have killed 94 million. Looks like it was payback time. Richard Spencer, another organizer and open white supremacist who, upon arriving at the rally, was received like this, denounced this tweet. What the fuck, man? Why are all these guys I thought were so cool and based acting like such little bitches? This is going to be a recurring trend you see over and over in the far right. Fascists themselves getting frustrated at the constraints of their own little game and how annoying respectability is. This is, of course, due to a core aspect of fascist ideology: purity. There always must be an enemy to scapegoat and target. You're one of the good ones until you're not. Any disqualifier can and will be used against you when convenient. When your group is obsessed with supremacy and purity, you'll eventually be whittled down to only the purest and most supreme. Hence why fascism is commonly referred to as a death cult. Half-assing and backstepping to preserve respectability can potentially take away from the grand narrative and thus draws the ire of those fighting in the narrative's honor. Let's remember that and take a look at a key figure in all this: Donald Trump. Yeah, I know I'm going all over the place at this point. You're the one who fucking clicked on an hour-long video about the far right. It's not my fault every one of these fuckers has like a dozen connections to other bullshit. Prior to Donald Trump, the far-right narrative in the West was limited and beholden to respectability in a different way. The neoliberal milquetoastedness of the GOP under Reagan and Bush's, which of course shared similar vile values and rhetoric to today's far-right, but due to relative positions of cultural dominance, and a freshly vanquished eternal enemy in the USSR, found it easier to stick with round one and just let the military or police deal with round two. Far-right sentiment remained distraught with this dynamic. Republicans in government were largely disappointing and half-assed. Neo-Nazi and far-right groups living in the end of history went through a sort of identity crisis. Neoliberal virtues of tolerance and freedom, etc. never quite sit well with them. At least I have a cigar-chomping radio guy soothing me, and the commies were defeated, but even with those pleasant facts at your disposal, shit wasn't really getting much better. Shit was getting more expensive, jobs were drying up, didn't seem like you were getting catered to as much. The good old days of some Norman Rockwell Vista were long behind you. You constantly have faceless and brain-numbing advertising manufacturing your every desire. And to top it off, the blacks are getting a little too big for their britches. The gays, too. What the fuck is going on? Your world is falling apart. Others notice it too. Your virtual buddies via the radio and eventually the internet forum agree. And they're fucking pissed. It's no coincidence shit is getting worse for you and better for them. Them. They are to blame. And my buddies agree. We need to get back to the fundamentals, fellas. What worked back then? Racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, might makes right. Yes, the glorious and mystical past of the early 20th century in classical Greece and primeval forest give us all the answers. It doesn't really matter that those answers are coming from a billionaire class interested in preserving their own power and setting the peasants against each other. You can easily morph those billionaires into the Jews or Marxist deep state cabal or both or whatever is convenient. And the kernel of truth of a conspiracy from above adds credibility to whoever you characterize them as long as the grand narrative contributes to the bottom line of preserving power. Throw in as much shit as you want. The bottom line is what makes a nonsensical amalgamation of the Roaring Twenties and Nordic Viking shit and the Crusades and the Roman Empire and classical Greece and Neanderthals, etc. all work. When coherence of reality doesn't matter, the narrative is free to be as grand as need be. Donald Trump was a fresh adopter of this strategy, preserving his position of wealth and power, even greatly expanding it by getting back to the fundamentals: outrage, hate, muddy waters, scapegoating, etc. The far right eagerly embraced this return to the basics and considered Trump a new champion of both round one, spewing and snaring rhetoric at fantastic new rates, and utilizing his institutional power to enact vengeance and punishment in round 2. He was magnificent, and we saw this by the sheer amount of old school and revamped neo-Nazi, white supremacist, and just plain bigoted sentiment resurfacing from every corner of the digital landscape like geysers, both organically and manufactured. The Charlottesville rallies had a large outpouring of right-wingers aiming to make America great again, like the Norman Rockwell painting and the ancient Greece and primeval forests all put together. I don't know how, but it's gonna be awesome. First things first, gotta get rid of those undesirables. You know who the undesirables are. Shit was gonna be so awesome with Big Don in charge. David Duke said in an interview that the protests were a turning point for the people of this country. We are determined to take our country back. We're going to fulfill the promises of Donald Trump. That's why we voted for Donald Trump, because he said he's going to take our country back. A little redundant there, buddy. Trump's first purity check was his response to the Charlottesville rallies and all the neo-Nazi white supremacist action that went on there, largely in his honor as new champion. At first, he stuck to the rulebook of round 1, reciting his obligatory denouncements and condemnation, which of course was necessary to remain respectable and whatnot. But he knew this new chapter in the grand narrative wasn't going to be pleasing for his biggest fans. So, eventually, he delivered what they wanted to hear, melding defensive Confederate generals with scapegoating Antifa and broadly the left, and even saving face for the neo-Nazis there, whilst somehow staying within the confines of round 1. It was impressive for his followers. For the far right at least, everyone else was fucking livid. But that didn't really matter too much. The far right treated Trump's response to the Charlottesville rallies like a victory. Like David Duke saying, "Thank you, President Trump, for your honesty and courage to tell the truth about #Charlottesville and condemn the leftist terrorists and BLM/Antifa." The Daily Stormer wrote of Trump's response, "He didn't attack us. No condemnation at all. When asked to condemn, he just walked out of the room. Really, really good. God bless him." Richard Spencer said that only an idiot would think he was being sincere with his denouncement and condemnation. Steve Bannon said his third statement was a defining moment. But to the purest narrative writers, this slight backpedaling in the beginning wasn't going to be ignored. Nick Fuentes, another, you guessed it, white supremacist anti-Semitic neo-Nazi, was at the Charlottesville rallies and said his reason for attending was to demonstrate against immigration, multiculturalism, and postmodernism. In other words, literally word for word everything Anders Breivik did his little act of terrorism for. But don't worry. Fuentes said to the Chicago Tribune he was not a racist and did not condone violence. Case closed, nothing to see here. Nick Fuentes is a perfect encapsulation of the modern far right, weaselly, rhetorically sharp, and perfectly fine with checking off the terms and conditions. He relishes round 1. Vindictive, hateful, grudge-holding, and bitter, he derives orgasmic pleasure from the events of round 2. He will say whatever it takes to disqualify his culpability and violence, and then celebrate the violence from a position of smug immunity and plausible deniability.
I say this as a campus conservative. I say this, we have to affirm, we believe in total equality. We do not endorse Nazism or white nationalism or white separatism or anything like that. We are merely campus conservatives who want to see every race, every group protected under the law. I don't want touch, I want a relationship. You know what I want? Total Aryan victory. That's all I want. I didn't choose that. All I want is revenge against my enemies and a total Aryan victory. Hugs and kisses, touch, sappy stuff, hand-holding, please. All I want is revenge and an Aryan victory for my people.
He also was a good example of fascist purity testing, and how the modern far right has continuously been driven further and further to the right. Fuentes makes a habit of shitting on other far-right media figures and rhetoricians such as Matt Walsh, Charlie Kirk, and even Donald Trump, calling into question their integrity and how much of a real one they really are. The sneaky part is how he makes this come across as valid and reasonable critique. Varg did a similar thing with Anders Breivik, albeit in a more fringe way. Neo-Nazis and white supremacists value Fuentes and his ability to move the far right even further right, while delivering an overwhelming amount of muddy water onto the whole scene. Hypocrisy isn't anything to worry about. He knows his greater purpose to the narrative is to keep it chugging along. He'll use a grab bag of political terminology and labels in whichever way is convenient. He'll denounce white nationalism while espousing white nationalist rhetoric. He'll say he's not rationalizing far-right violence, while rationalizing far-right violence, all in an effort to keep the real ones steadily marching further right, which in turn requires the mainstream media and politicians to follow suit, lest they get called bitches or whatever. An example of Fuentes saying he's not rationalizing far-right violence while rationalizing far-right violence, is the 2019 Christchurch shootings, where, yep, neo-Nazi white supremacist and anti-immigrant Brenton Tarrant shot and killed 51 and injured 89 at 2 separate mosques in New Zealand. He live-streamed the first, and was on his way to a third mosque before being stopped by police. Tarrant cited Anders Breivik and Dylann Roof as inspiration, and named his manifesto The Great Replacement, referring to the conspiracy theory in which white people are being replaced by non-white immigrants, often Muslims, and of course this whole thing is being operated by a Jewish cabal. This theory, once a fringe and obscure concept of a random French author, is now widely propagated by even the most mainstream conservative media figures, especially in Europe given their proximity to the Middle East, but as well in the US with their proximity to Latin America, including Tucker Carlson, Matt Walsh, and Donald Trump, all people Fuentes has criticized for not being far-right enough. The conservative establishment legitimizes far-right narrative components, such as the Great Replacement, and finds utility in its manipulability and obscurant effect for their preservation of power and furtherance of policy. This has the unfortunate effect of requiring further and further shifts to the right to keep up with the wide-open narrative floodgate, leading to more and more extreme rhetoric being espoused, which of course includes might makes right, and inevitably leads to these very crafters of fringe narratives and far-right rhetoric into positions of legitimized power, like we saw in the footsteps of Donald Trump. All of this has the effect of continuing right-wing policy like austerity and militarization, which lead to deteriorating conditions for the people, which leads to dissatisfaction and scapegoating, which leads to far-right narratives and confronting these myriad problems with a blindfold and a firearm. Rhetoricians and narrative refiners like Nick Fuentes justify this vicious cycle and horrendous outcomes by feeding it back into the grand narrative. Historical and material analysis is shredded, burned, and its ashes tossed in the trash. Bad shit that happens, like war and mass shootings, etc., is used as a tool to continue the slide to the right, which of course perpetuates the material conditions that lead to the bad shit happening. But that critical analysis can be ignored when the bad shit itself can help build on the narrative. Dylann Roof doing a white supremacist mass shooting, even if on a material basis is nothing more than a rube blaming a scapegoat for his shitty material conditions, contributes to the grand narrative by being an example of a federal Jewish ploy to strip you of your gun rights, or to make you feel bad for being white, etc.
Understand that it's actually a two-way street. They don't treat it like a two-way street, but it really is a two-way street. This is the future of the country if people don't get a grip on what the real problem is. These things, they don't just happen, okay? Hate to say it. I really hate to say that because I don't want to sound like I'm justifying or rationalizing anything, because I'm not. But this doesn't come from nowhere. Are we going to pretend like we don't know why this happened? Are we really that naive? Are we going to play that dumb that we don't understand why this is going on? It goes on because of things like this and like this. You didn't have people like this walking around 100 years ago. I'm going to fly to Egypt and shoot up a mosque. That never happened. That never happened before. I mean, you had colonialism, but you know what I'm talking about. In terms of this kind of terrorism, it didn't happen before because this wasn't a problem. And that's not to justify, that's not to rationalize even. This is justice. So it is perverted. It is a sick and horrible thought process that is not rational. That no sane person arrives at. But that's ultimately what that's an expression of. I see injustice happening over here. I see a tragedy and atrocity visited upon my people by these perceived outsiders. Nobody's doing anything about it. Nobody can do anything about it. And somebody who's got no friends, lonely, isolated, whatever, goes down a path where they find some perverted way where they're going to try and attempt to rectify that situation. And then it happens again. And then the process repeats itself. And then you start to see, okay, everybody's in the wrong here. These guys are wrong. These guys are wrong. Everybody's wrong. We see the double standard also. But at a certain point, we have to accept, okay, maybe this whole picture can be prevented. Maybe the problem is not, we're going to use this as political football for the left when it happens. We're going to use this as political football for the right when it happens. Maybe we can kind of take a step back and realize maybe there's something deeper going on, right? Maybe there's something deeper going on. Of course, these people, if they weren't in Europe, it wouldn't be a problem. And then you start to wonder, gee, you wouldn't have truck attacks, and you also wouldn't have mosque shootings, and you wouldn't have Easter bombings if these people weren't living in the same countries. Am I a crazy person for saying that? Am I a hateful, racist, white supremacist for saying that? I don't understand why that's a terrible thing. I said it after Christchurch. But why is that such a bad thing to say? If this line, what if this line was not dotted? What if you just drew a big black line, and then you couldn't draw arrows anymore because these guys stayed over here in a little place called the Middle East, and these guys stayed over here in a place called Europe, North America, Australia. There's no arrows, there's no crossfire. It's just, we're going to hang out over here, and, we're going to deal with each other. We'll enjoy our decisions and our way of life, and we'll be over here enjoying our way of life. You got a problem with white nationalists and people wanting to have a white nation, and, we've got a problem with Sharia law. I've got a solution. You can have Sharia law. We can have whatever it is that we want, whether it's, white people and their fill in the blank. You can hang out over here, and we can hang out over here. No, I don't know. Maybe that comes across as white nationalism. I would never defend white nationalism. All I'm saying is, because I'm not that. I'm a campus conservative. As a campus conservative, I'm applying facts and logic to this problem. I see a tremendous problem. I see a lot of this in our future, of intersectional variety of these kinds of conflicts happening, increasing in frequency, increasing in severity, and nobody really wants to talk about the elephant in the room, which is they wouldn't be happening if the people weren't geographically in the same location. That should be simple and obvious, but for some reason, we don't understand that. That's what it comes down to, diversity. That's really ultimately what it comes down to. Diversity is our strength. We made a virtue out of hanging out with people that aren't like us. Why is that virtuous? Why is it a virtuous thing to embark on a project which is doomed to fail, right? They say that it's like the moon landing. I've seen a lot of Jewish journalists, they say, well, the reason we are pursuing diversity, yes, it's got its setbacks, there are challenges, but we're doing it because it's hard. What's the value? What is the virtue in embracing something which is going to lead to hundreds of people killed and slaughtered in the streets all the time? To what end? Why? Why is that a positive good? So we can say, look, we overcame race. Oh, like, why should we have to? Why is that a good thing? It's baked into our nature.
Nick Fuentes discussed the Christchurch shootings from a position of, well, the Muslims did it first, and, well, none of this would happen if we lived in a world without multiculturalism. Of course, he delivered the obligatory qualifiers of condemning violence, blah blah blah, including not being a white nationalist, but immediately states how a white nationalist strategy is the only solution. And what do you think comes from that? The common obfuscating retort and narrative explanation about undeniable far-right violence is the comparison and contrasting with Islamic extremist violence. Islamic extremist violence, in the eyes of the far right, due to their anti-immigrant and Islamophobic beliefs, is viewed as a mutually exclusive opposite. Because of being viewed as an opposite, it must be leftist or a result of leftist policies, such as the aforementioned scapegoat of multiculturalism, especially considering these Muslims are brown. Little discussed are the material reasons as to why extremist Islamic fundamentalist groups exist and grow, primarily due to Western destabilization in the Middle East, vilification and racialization of Islam, and dozens of wars over the course of decades, as well as concerted efforts by the CIA, for instance, in supporting hyper-conservative fundamentalist groups and leadership. Western interests consider hyper-conservative fundamentalists as easier to manipulate and help protect their positions of power in the region. People in the region becoming radicalized and antagonistic towards the West, resulting in terrorist attacks and anti-Western opposition, is referred to by the CIA as blowback. Islamic extremism is undeniably a result of right-wing foreign policy. As a result of the destabilization in these areas, many people are forced to flee their homes, and because the West conveniently avoided the destabilizing efforts of their own foreign policy, of course it's the only place not bombed to fuck or exploited to fuck for these people to go. Also, if we're getting a little frisky, due to right-wing policy exacerbating climate change, an even greater number of migrants fleeing countries affected by climate catastrophe, most often countries in the global south, will occur. Right-wing policy, even if not draped in a Nazi flag or Sonnenrad, is responsible for migration and, in turn, provokes the very issues right-wing rhetoricians attempt to solve. Additionally, even if this clear causation is ignored, like Nick Fuentes does here, there is still the character of Islamic extremists when it comes to ideology. Islamic fundamentalists share many core traits with the far right: xenophobia, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and a religious justification for all of these. They value the philosophy of might makes right, excusing brazen violence and terrorism by virtue of it being in and of itself virtuous. Where would Nick Fuentes or Anders Breivik or Breton Tarrant disagree with any of this, other than them being the ones on the wrong side of the gun barrel? And of course them being brown. That automatically disqualifies them. These traits of Islamic extremism aren't lost on the right. In fact, they are used as characterizations of Muslim people as a whole, being incompatible with leftism, and therefore it's hypocritical for a leftist to defend a Muslim. They'd throw you off a roof for being gay. I mean, I would too, but hey, I'm not one of those brown people you love to defend. Brownness and opposition to the West are enough for the far right to discount their similarities and continuities of ideology. A coping strategy that positions obvious leftist hypocrisy and rhetorical victory on a flimsy bed of lies. Nick Fuentes minimizes far-right neo-Nazi violence by the likes of Brandon Tarrant, Dylann Roof, Anders Breivik, and a myriad others, due to a concocted contrast with far-right religious fundamentalist Islamic violence. This contrast is proof of the need for ethno-states. It just so happens that white Americans, Australians, South Africans, and Canadians get to stay on the land they took by force and genocide, and the immigrants economically forced to leave their homes are the ones that must do the leaving. It's almost like might makes right or something. Taken for what they truly are, and not some lie of Islamic extremism being inherently the left's fault. Hate crimes like the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016, where American-born Omar Mateen shot and killed 49 and injured 53, is an act of reactionary homophobia. Is that completely unrelated to far-right ideology? Even then, the far-right blasted everywhere they could that the shooter was a Democrat, an immigrant, and all of a sudden this homophobic hate crime is culpable to the left. The 2016 shooting in Munich, where a shooter of Iranian descent killed 10, was posed by the right as an issue of immigration and migrant crime and Islam not being compatible. even when the shooter was a far-right, racist, and xenophobe who was inspired by other mass shooters such as Anders Breivik, doing his shooting on the 5th anniversary of the 2011 Norway attacks. He also bragged about sharing a birthday with Hitler, considered himself part of the Aryan race, but because he was brown and had the name Ali, which he legally changed his name to David, by the way, this was a completely separate act of violence unrelated to the far right. This blatant ignorance and lying in service of the grand narrative isn't limited to Islam. The 2025 Nashville school shooter, who cited Nick Fuentes himself, along with several other far-right influencers, shot and killed a fellow student and then himself. He referenced Timothy McVeigh and Brenton Tarrant, Patrick Wood-Crusius, Anders Breivik, the Columbine shooters, and all commonly accepted saints/martyrs. He proclaimed a hatred of all lesser races and just spouted the same old neo-Nazi shit. But he was black, so cancels out. He, like Fuentes, a quarter Mexican, is a self-hating white supremacist, distraught about being less than the master race. He referred to himself as an involuntary N-word. But again, the kid was black, so he can't be far right. The 2022 shooting at a gay bar in Colorado, where a homophobic shooter killed 5, was portrayed as gay-on-gay crime and a result of trans ideology, because the shooter, once in custody, said he was non-binary. The shooter never identified as non-binary before, and even has a history of using homophobic slurs and just being generally bigoted, but that's all ignored to suit the grand narrative of gay immorality and some such. The media firestorm that came from the shooting involved an obscene amount of anti-gay and anti-trans rhetoric from the right. Even while doing research for this video, I came across this ridiculous article with the ostensible aim of blaming the assassination of Charlie Kirk on a radicalized leftist and discounting the existence of right-wing violence, where he calls into question Timothy McVeigh's ideology. As I suspected, he categorized Timothy McVeigh's ideology as right-wing, but this classification is debatable. McVeigh was an anti-government extremist whose rage stemmed from anger over the Waco siege and the Ruby Ridge standoff, not from conservative ideology. McVeigh rejected both political parties, described himself as agnostic, supported abortion rights, and drew inspiration from militia and anarchist movements rather than conservatism. He also says the aforementioned Club Q shooter wasn't right-wing because he claimed he was non-binary. So the 2022 Buffalo supermarket shooter wasn't right-wing because he called himself an eco-fascist national socialist. And the El Paso Walmart shooter wasn't right-wing because he called himself an eco-fascist as well. A trans cool shooter, a femcel shooter, when there's enough muddy water, hate, guns, and blindfolds scattered about, any and every identity is going to at some point pick one up. Gender or race doesn't automatically give you more leftism points, especially when you're an idiosyncratic internet brain-rotted teenager who never read a fucking book. That doesn't matter to the grand narrative. An anti-ice engraving on a bullet casing is enough evidence to consider the shooting first mentioned in this video an act of leftist violence. The truth doesn't matter when loads of horseshit is thrown into the wind and water gets ridiculously muddied. Another way the water is muddied is by adding to the narrative a sort of numbers game. For example, the aforementioned shit-fuck-ass article posits the Black Lives Matter riots and at least 19 deaths and billions in property damage as a comparable figure to far-right mass shooters, much like the contrast to Islamic violence.
You see, these numbers here excuse my racism. Checkmate.
But, much like Islamic violence, the Black Lives Matter death count is contorted and concocted to come up with a number high enough to seem like a comparable trend. Look through the deaths attributed to it one by one. A looter shot and killed by a store owner. A man run over by a FedEx truck. A bunch of coincidentally white men killing black men out of self-defense. Several innocent protesters shot and killed by police. A guy driving into a crowd of protesters. Kyle Rittenhouse himself traveling to the protest with a gun, actively aiming to kill people. And a woman killed for shouting the N-word at protesters. Yeah, I guess I can count that one as left-wing violence. Score one for you. The point is that comparing tallies like this is ridiculous and often just flat out disingenuous and wrong. Is adding up vastly different deaths like these in a span of 3 years and across the entire country comparable to a single guy in a span of just a couple minutes killing dozens of people? No, of course not. The whole point of discussing political violence from the perspective of pure numbers is absurd, not only for the fact that right-wing violence accounts for the vast majority, but because it completely takes away from the quality of the violence. Broken windows, spray-painted walls, torched police cars, and even killing someone for being a racist asshole, as fucked up as all that is obviously different and of a drastically disparate quality compared to white supremacist mass shootings inspired by far-right rhetoricians and previous mass murders. The mystical storybook identity of a looter or thug or criminal is necessary for the narrative to justify its vilification and dehumanization of whoever is deemed villainous or subhuman. Violence in the name of might makes right is of a different quality than violence in the name of egalitarianism. You can piss and moan at that or come up with some bullshit appeal to statistics and numbers all you want. It does nothing to change the dynamics of power and policy at play surrounding potential political violence. All it does is muddy waters in service to the grand narrative. Fuentes is a proud muddy waterer. He's not the only one, nor is he particularly special. The consolidation of the far right under Trump led to a proliferation of muddy water being launched by every Tom, Dick, and Susie with a smartphone. Gone were the days where the right eagerly listened to fireside chats with Rush Limbaugh or Glenn Beck or whoever else had the special title of influencer. Today, anyone with a hot take and a witch hunt to sell can be an influencer, and eventually, even a politician or cabinet member. Not only does this lead to unfathomable amounts of lies, misinformation, shilling, snake oil peddling, smears, and most importantly, myth-making and narrative crafting, it leads to a further slide to the right. Republicans in name only aren't going to cut it anymore, Buster. Even Trump himself is slowly becoming mistrusted amongst the truest of the true, something he knows and desperately attempts to prevent. You gotta prove your purity and virtue, or lack thereof. You must fight the enemy, or else you're as good as the enemy. The best way to do that is to craft a narrative worth fighting for. From the Democratic conspiracy to take your guns, to the Brown invasion of the Great Replacement, to the trans mind virus, these narratives are the carrot of which the far right is led by a ruthless, cynical, and self-interested wielder of the stick. Further desperation and ferocity of the far right leads to further statements of purity and virtue by far-right thought leaders, which lead to further calls for intensified reprisals. In order to remain in power, you must cater to your ravenous base, eagerly awaiting the next chapter of the grand narrative. The outcome of feeding your ravenous, vengeful base is exactly what you told them to do. Take what's theirs. Do what's right. Might makes right. Now you might be thinking, if right-wing policy makes the material conditions of the far right worse, why do they support it so much? Well, simply put, they're tricked. The grand narrative was always a lie, just a strategy to make the peasants fight amongst themselves or make a convenient scapegoat, obviously in most cases for the extremely rich and powerful. Donald Trump is obviously a billionaire, and his policy is supported by other billionaires. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, OpenAI guy, whatever the fuck is, even the, for whatever reason, liberal billionaires like Bill Gates or Tim Cook, amongst dozens of other more shadowy figures and families, like the Koch brothers, Peter Thiel, Larry Ellison, the list goes on. These are the deep state cabal leaders that fuck all the shit up for regular Joe Schmoes, and give a kernel of truth towards the core grand narrative component of there being a deep state cabal. But, if foolishly presented in a real and material manner, obviously jeopardizes their grip on power in this whole entire thing, hence why the grand narrative is necessary. But what about the Joe Schmoes who contribute to the narrative? Why do they do it if they aren't billionaires? Because they have a vested self-interest in this whole thing too, if not on the same scale as the ruling class, but for their own podcast or internet radio TV show or pillow or coffee brand, etc. With the expansion of the grand narrative, there's a shitload of money to be made, and after Trump, a real possibility in getting into a position of power. So, for all of this potential glory's sake, It's crucial to craft an effective narrative, diverting the blame for the failures of their own policies on Jews, Muslims, browns and blacks, women, gays, trans, commies, the left, or anyone convenient and effective enough to rile up your moneymakers. Mass shootings, bombings, stabbings, lynchings, or fill-in-the-blank violence is the price that your success is built on. And it's worth it, especially if the last guy is actually kind of based. But you're never immune. The death cult constantly churns out new heroes and villains for the grand narrative. You have no telling which one you'll end up as. There's no telling what story will come out of the floodgates next. Maybe you'll be the next Secretary of State. Maybe you'll make a bunch of dough selling AI-generated shirts. Maybe you'll be an infamous rhetorical spinster, taking it to your ideological enemies. Or maybe you'll work a shitty job for the rest of your life, just getting angrier. Maybe you'll end up as one of those guys that makes it look really convenient for the left, but really is just an example of the feds trying to make us look bad. Maybe you'll become some kind of martyr with your still warm corpse, grinded up into the narrative machine. Or maybe you'll just put on a blindfold and say fuck it. Right-wing violence is the result of disastrous policy and successful narrative. Some guys fuck up some things, rile shit up, point the finger, and cash out. Potential profits in a nice, comfy storybook version of the world where you're always the good guy, they're always the bad guy. Sounds nice. Your children at school pay the price. People going to a nightclub pay the price. Churchgoers, youth at camp, and just people going to work pay the price. You pay the price. You live in a world where happiness and fulfillment requires the oppression and annihilation of someone or some group. You live in a world where mass suffering is acceptable and natural. You live in a world where a past that never existed is treated as the answer to a future that will never come. But rest easy. Your contribution to the narrative made some of the worst people to ever exist a whole lot of money. That was well worth all the torment, paranoia, anger, fear, and blood soaking the earth. At least you get to play the hero beneath that blindfold.